that they're often quite outlandish and over the top, right? So Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is disqualified from office. Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. And the FBI agent involved in the email investigation is dead in a murder-suicide. Okay? But there are many, many more cases like this. There's a whole industry of fake news that sprung up during the campaign. Okay? To give you a sense of the magnitude of this, Silverman found that the most shared fake news stories, according to the public Facebook sharing data. Of course, the Facebook data science team knows more about this than I do, but I can tell you from the public sharing data that he found the most shared fake news stories were shared more often than the most shared mainstream news stories in that period before the election. Now, that doesn't mean that the audience for fake news was greater, okay? Because there were a few viral hits and a lot of duds in the fake news, in the set of fake news articles that were published, right? So it's still the case that the mainstream media was far more widely shared during that period. But it does suggest how quickly these kinds of stories can reach a very large audience, right? So if you imagine this many million shares happening on Facebook and how many times people are at least passing by the headline, if not necessarily reading the article, these seem to have been very widespread, right? And many of you probably saw these at some point during the election campaign. Okay. Now, it's hard to say exactly how many. Again, the Facebook data science team knows, I don't, but we can try to answer this question in some different ways. So Silverman and his colleague at BuzzFeed went back and asked people, did you remember seeing or hearing about this story in the last few weeks? And they find somewhere between approximately 10 and 20% of Americans said they did. This is a survey fielded very soon after the election. Now, the problem with this, as you're probably thinking, is, of course, it's hard to remember every news story I saw, and that's true. Okay, so what we'd really like to have is who clicked through and who read this using behavioral data rather than a self-reported recall measure like this, right? Some of these people may be falsely believing they saw a story and they never actually saw it, and vice versa. Okay, but it gives you a sense of the approximate magnitude. And what they did find was among those folks who said they had seen or heard about these stories, that somewhere around 2/3 to 4/5 believe that these stories were accurate. Okay, so it seems like there was a non-trivial number of Americans who encountered these stories, remembered them, and believed them. Okay. There's similar data here from two economists, Alcott and Genskow. It's a little bit small on the slide. The grouping of interest is in the middle portion of the y-axis, the false stories, where they asked people again, do you think this was true? And they showed them a bunch of false headlines, as well as some true ones and some placebo headlines they made up. And what you can see is, again, around 10 to 20% of Americans for any given fake news headline said they believed it was true. A very large number, though, said they didn't know or they weren't sure, right? Often 50% of the public or more, which is troubling if you look at what the content of these sorts of fake news headlines was. For example, the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton is involved in a pedophilia ring being run out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., right? So somewhere around, if you look at the line there, that 40 to 50% of Americans are saying either that's true or they're not sure, right? So we'd really like the answer to be no, right? That it's false. Okay. So these things can, again, even for those people who don't believe them, they raise questions and doubts potentially that may be worrisome, right? People may be vulnerable to at least calling into question things that we wouldn't like to be called into question because they are in fact false. So why did this happen? Okay, so I want to just identify two factors you might think about, and it's obviously relevant to how people interact with Google in its various forms. We're vulnerable to this, right? First is the choice of the information we consume, which is often called selective exposure. That in some contexts, in some circumstances, we pick and choose the information we consume according to the extent to which it's consistent with our political preferences. Okay? That's going to vary depending on the context you're in and the motivation you have to seek out that sort of information. As I'll show you, and as DJ suggested, it's not universal. But it's very much a threat, especially in the context of something like a campaign when people's political emotions are at a fever pitch, right? That was as passionate about politics as people get, and that was a time when people might be especially interested in something that seemed to confirm how they felt about a candidate or to disconfirm something they'd like to hear disconfirmed. The second problem is what's called directionally